I think we were originally scheduled to be here at the end of October. And at that point, as Emily said, the topic was to talk about the election and why poverty was not part of the national conversation. Interesting that it wasn't, and that it still is not. Poverty in the country has reached new heights in the sense that the numbers, and you're getting some information out there, but there actually was a new report that was just issued by the Census Bureau. It's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, the SPM, and that number, which is a way of measuring poverty when you include the benefits. So you include food stamps and you include some of the other services. That number actually raises the poverty level rather than lowering it. So that at this point in time, you're probably talking about 50 million people in the United States who are living in poverty. And that figure, as you'll see from the charts, the figure for a family of 4 is about 22,314, 22,400. Now, what I would point out to you is that if you work full-time in this country, if you work full-time and you're making $10 an hour, and there are very few places in this country where that's the minimum wage. But if you're working full-time and earning $10 an hour, you are in poverty because you're making $20,000. That's working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks of the year with no breaks. You're making roughly $20,000 and change. And if you're the head of a family, say a family with 3 people, you're slightly above poverty, because poverty for a family of 3, which would in often cases be a single mother, who, if she's making that $10, okay, is making about 20, and the poverty figure is 17. But remember that the minimum wage throughout the country is, I think the federal is about $7, a little over 7. It's a little bit more. Somebody can correct me on that. I'm not. $7.25. So if you take that, then even if you're working full time with a family of 3, you're not making what would be considered the poverty wage for a family. The issue is that when you take that wage and you take that number, okay, there are a number of factors that come into play that actually increase the poverty issue. In many cases, as we look at these numbers, what we see is that people who are in poverty are spending 60+% of their income for housing. So that leaves you with a little less. You know? The other thing we've noted now is that because of the housing situation, which is pervasive through this country, the lack of affordable housing. To give you an example, a number of years ago, if you had Section 8 vouchers, you had a number of Section 8 vouchers that were across the country. Okay? Right now, the allotment of Section 8 vouchers, which is the housing assistance program, what was the national level, okay, is actually now reduced down so that the average wait time in the city of New York for a Section 8 voucher can be in excess of 10 years on the waiting list. Okay. The Section 8 voucher would, in a sense, give you the the income, in the sense of gives you the benefit of allowing you to pay only a third of your income, for the housing that you would have, the government supplying the rest. But those numbers have shrunk so drastically, the allotment for that particular program is almost non-existent at this point. As you look at, again, these issues, what you find also is that poverty, while it has grown, and you can see the numbers there, you see the chart, it shows you the dramatic increase, and that increase did not come exclusively as a result of the recession, but it started before that. And it's been tracking upward so that we now have more poor in this country than when Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty, which would have been back in the late 60s, the mid-60s, 67 or so. Why? Well, part of it is what has happened in our economy. Okay. Both the employment situation, directly related to the attacks that have been made on the unions. If you trace the history of growth in this country, particularly economic growth, you would find that for the most part, as unions gained strength and were able to get more generous contracts, okay, the way that you kept the union out of your business was that you treated your workers better, with the hope that they would not get into the union movement. In the early 1980s, you might remember there was a strike that went on with the air controllers. And that strike was broken by the federal government. And it was the beginning of the dismantling of the union movement in this country. Now, that's not to say that unions are the best thing that God ever delivered to the earth. Okay? They have their problems, and they certainly have had more than their share of difficulties. But they contributed greatly to the growth of a middle class in this country by organizing and advocating for the rights of workers, both income-wise, salary-wise, as well as benefit-wise. At their height, unions represented about 33+% of the workforce. Unions now represent around 10%, with the numbers going down. And again, I think if you look at the tracking, you'll see the direct correlation between the destruction of the union movement and the increase in poverty. It's a phenomena that we're dealing with. The other part of it that goes into the issue of poverty is lack of access to quality education. Here in our own city, we still have large numbers of our young who are not graduating high school. Part of that is because while we had a so-called policy of, how could I put it, breaking up the ghetto schools, the reality is that the ghetto schools are more in place now than they were before we started the breakup, because of the nature of our communities and the fact that our communities are very racially intact versus racially mixed. If you look at the school system then, and you look at how those schools rank, when you get into the rankings, you clearly see that if you are in a school where there is a minority population a poverty area in our city, and those poverty areas have become more closed in on themselves as a result of a lot of the other issues that are going on in our city. But if you look at the schools in those districts, you'll find that most of them are averaging 50% or lower than when you look at reading and math scores. So that in a sense, opportunity, which is directly related to one's ability to function in a complex society, is extremely limited. And as a result of that, you have a perpetuation of poverty in some of these areas. Those are just a few of the issues that we face. The other great issue that we face here in New York, and it's interesting, I was doing a little research for this talk and found an article that had been written in the 1990s that talked about the growing gap, income gap, in the city of New York between the rich and the poor. Well, rather than seeing that as a challenge to be overcome, we've actually grown it. So that the income gap in the city of New York between the rich and the poor is the greatest it's ever been. It actually puts New York, for all of its success, puts this city into a third world category because of the gap that exists between the rich and the poor. How is that playing out if you're on the side of the poor? Well, what it is doing is it's causing the volume of housing, the availability of housing, to be decreased for you if you're poor. So that if you look around our city in the neighborhoods of the poor, what you find is that more and more the poor are being put into a position of having to share space. Share space with others for two reasons. One, availability of affordable housing, but the other being the cost of housing even in poor neighborhoods. And so the average family living in poverty could never afford to pay the rent for their own apartment. So they have to share with others. The other issue that has resulted in is that you now have the largest number of homeless in the city of New York. 40,000 before the hurricane. Of that, 18,000 are children who are living in shelters and then being transported through various means to schools. Well, think about what that does to a child. Living in a shelter and then having to either maneuver their way through the transportation system we have to find their way to a school where by the time they get there, they're already exhausted and they're already hungry. How much time can that child actually devote to pursuing an education? Hardly any. In a sense, the system perpetuates the poverty that child will live in. All of this paints a picture for us. And it paints what I consider to be an extremely unpleasant and unjust system that is crying out for some amelioration. Certainly one of the easiest ways to be able to deal with this is the minimum wage. You know, if you were able, and not the $8.50 that they're talking about in Albany at this point, that won't do much to get anybody out of poverty, but realistic, real wages commensurate with the work opportunities that are there. You would have to have probably a wage in the neighborhood of $15 an hour, plus benefits, in order to ensure that people who are working 40 hours a week would have the resources they need in order to be able to support themselves and their families. And again, we're talking in the context of being able to provide support to a family. Rather than the present situation, which if you're only working one job at minimum wage, you're not even coming close to the poverty level, even with all of the benefits that you can add in there, should you be able to access those benefits. Or you're working 2 minimum wage jobs. And we would be shocked at the number of people who are working 2 minimum wage jobs. I can tell you that people who are doing home care, people who are working in nursing homes, almost all of them are working 2 jobs, 2 8-hour shifts. The reason they're working 2 8-hour shifts is because the funding that comes in to support those entities is continually under siege and continually being cut. And as a result of that, there is no room in the system for the institution, as well-meaning as the institution might be, to actually provide a living wage. And so, again, most of those people who are providing very, very needed service, because those of us who are advancing in years know how difficult it is to get by without some support systems, be it in your home or be it, should the need arise, in a care facility. These are the people who are taking care of us and our loved ones, but are being put in this position because, again, of our unwillingness to pay decent wages, provide benefits, and beyond that, our unwillingness to adjust an unfair tax system that will not, in a sense, provide the resources at the government level, which in turn then allow us to pay for the needed services of people. So the issue is complex in one sense, but the solution is, perhaps in my mind, simple. Because it really means that you have to take this system and you have to rework it. And you have to rework it at a minimum with living wages associated with the appropriate benefits. You have to invest in affordable housing. You have to have quality education. And you have to have job training for those who are, in a sense, in that situation of needing to find their way in the midst of this very complicated, highly technical society that we're building here. Where will you get the money to do that? You get the money to do it by adjusting our tax programs, and also by making adjustments in how we spend money. Where are our values? Okay? And that's where, in a sense, we come in. We just finished a major presidential campaign. The campaign cost in excess of $1 billion. Yet, if you look at that campaign and the track record of the campaign, you'll find that poverty was not part of the conversation. Education was not part of the conversation. Housing was not part of the conversation. The conversation was about taxes. And how can the rich, in quotes, keep more of their money? You saw the interest in the campaign. The interest in the campaign, for the first time in our history, was primarily a campaign funded by the corporate world and by special interests within the corporate world. I'm not sure any of you were able to make a campaign contribution in the neighborhood of $30+ million, but an individual in Las Vegas who had some very, very personal interests was able to do that without question.
And his wife.
And his wife and some of their friends. What has happened, in my opinion, what has happened, and one of the reasons why poverty, I think, is the kind of, how could I put it, the unattended issue in our society today, is because the voice of the poor has been silenced. Part of the reason the voice of the poor has been silenced is they're caught up in trying to survive, to get by from one day to another, and they don't have time to get engaged. The voice that would have benefited them, the voice of the working poor and the working class in a large sense, the union movement, has been decimated. And so that voice, which often had the ability to raise a lot of these issues, again, from a self-interest of their own membership, to the larger community, has been silenced because they're caught up in the fight for survival. And so when you put those pieces together, you realize the challenge that's in front of us. And it is a challenge that really, again, I think, will determine what our future looks like. Okay? Will we continue to go in the direction of a country that is made up, in a city that's made up of the rich and the poor? Or will we go back to try to build those integrated communities that are integrated not merely on racial lines, but integrated on economic lines that have as their focus the well-being of families and individuals? Are we going to build a society that values each and every person, irregardless of where they stand, and willing to provide them with the benefits that they need in order to become productive citizens? Because otherwise, where we are today is nothing in comparison to where we will be a few years from now as we continue down this path. You're correct that as a federal employee, you sign the agreement that you will not strike against. However, there are times when laws need to be broken because the issues of justice are greater than that contract that you sign. In that particular case, the issues were around salary, work situations, an unwillingness to hire more people and develop a safer air trafficking system. That's what the union was advocating for. The federal government saw it as an opportunity to begin to dismantle the union movement. And they knew that if they took out that particular, if they took advantage of that opportunity, they would begin to empower others along the same lines. The estimates at this moment, as I said, we started out prior to Hurricane Sandy with 40,000 homeless. The numbers are now in excess of 100,000. Many of those are middle-income people. The vast majority of them are actually middle-income people who are private home owners, who are in desperate need of support and assistance at this point, because many of them, either as a result of the recession and their work situation or lifestyle issues, okay, were living paycheck to paycheck. And when you look at now having to come up with 100,000 plus to put your house back in order without some access to federal assistance, state, city assistance, or some type of government aid, it is going to be extremely difficult. We have to look at that, and we have to see how do you deal with that in a realistic way. But at the same time, we need to help the people who are in those situations to truly reflect on their life situation. As I said to the people in my congregation on Sunday, you know, if you walked out in our neighborhood, Howard Beach, the day after the hurricane and people started emptying out their houses, you know, the 70-inch television was sitting out in the street. Do you really need to replace a 70-inch flat-screen TV? You've got to make some choices now. But that's a whole lifestyle issue. And that's going to be even more complicated to deal with than, you know, some of the the basic issues is you need a furnace, you need a hot water heater, you need to deal with the mold. You know, you need to deal with the basic issues that make your home habitable. Do you need 5 televisions? You know, those are the issues, and that's going to be the more complex part of this. You know, the bulk of the cost is going to come in making homes habitable again, you know, and dealing with those basic living situations. But people also need to get educated about choice and the choices you make in what you're going to put into those places. It's going to be very, very challenging. And in the present situation, with the fiscal cliff hanging over everybody's head as we go forward here, it's going to be even that much more complicated. The president has asked for $60 billion. The governors of New York and New Jersey, if you put together what they've asked for, they've asked for about $84 billion. So there's already a gap of 24. It's not realistic, in my mind, it's not realistic to think that the Congress is going to allocate the 60. Okay? So the gaps are going to be tremendous. And that's going to put stress in the system like we've not seen before. Unfortunately, the losers in that situation will probably be the poor, because they're going to have to go places to find resources to make available. One group is far more politically active than the other, and so those choices will be very difficult. But again, it's something that we need to be on top of, something we need to speak to, you know, as we go forward. The larger questions are systemic questions. And unless you deal with the systemic questions and begin to really revamp the system, you know, as radical as that is, unless that occurs, there are no answers. I mean, you can give out a can of food today, you can give out a can of food tomorrow, and you can give out a can of food a week from now. It's not going to solve the problem. It's certainly aiding and giving a little bit of relief, but it's not going to solve the problem. The problems are far greater. And unless we can educate ourselves and educate our communities so that we're not the silent voice within the system, but we're the educated people who are able to participate in the policy making that goes on in the country. We leave it in the hands of the moguls from Vegas who can throw away $40 million to see if they can win their way. The numbers that we're using, the 50 million, go up drastically when you include the undocumented. Because the vast majority of that 11 million people who are here, the vast majority of those people are working in low-wage jobs with no benefits. They would have to be calculated, and I would estimate that if you add that piece to the puzzle, you're probably talking closer to 60 million people in poverty in this country. We desperately need to adjust the immigration policies in this country. There are people who have been here for 15, 20 years who have paid into the system, who are hardworking, and who should have access to legal status in 24 hours, adjusting the system. Whether or not that can happen, again, it goes back to the economics. See, if I add those people in, and I'm the employer, then I'm going to have to assume liability for their FICA, for their health care, and for a whole lot of other pieces which add to the competitiveness of the workplace. Why would I want to do that? You're cutting into the profits. And my salary as the head of the entity is dependent upon the profits I produce for the shareholders. So you've got to balance that. There's no reason why someone who's earning their income because they're able to divert it through the capital gain should not be obligated to a progressive tax system. The other thing is that, as we have learned from Hurricane Sandy, and we learned it from Hurricane Katrina before Hurricane Sandy, and you can go back through these things, we're a country who abandoned our infrastructure. And as a result of that, these catastrophes are greater than we ever could anticipate. We could put everybody back to work tomorrow morning. If everybody's working, everybody's paying taxes. If everybody's paying taxes, then government has the money to do the things it needs to do in keeping quality service available to the people. There's no mystery here. This is not, what it is self-interest by a certain segment of the population at the expense of the rest of the population. And unfortunately, that self-interest is part of this whole global economy and the structures that are going on in the global economy. I mean, you buy a pair of sneakers here for $100. I can't figure out why anybody would spend $100 for a pair of sneakers, but that's what they do. Trace it back to the worker in India who's getting what, $1 a day? See? Well, what would happen in a global economy where that person was being fairly paid for their labor and had the resources to purchase the products that are being produced in another part of the world where people are being fairly paid? All of a sudden, you might see a very different economic situation where things would be far more balanced and people would have access to what they need for decent living.